All right, I'm Blaine Jennings with Legalize Louisiana, and we're here with our first episode of our podcast. And we're fortunate enough to land Richard Nelson, who's running for governor for the great state of Louisiana. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say he's our next governor of Louisiana.
Of course.
I'm going in with all the confidence in the world. And we appreciate you coming out to Louisiana and Lafayette, Louisiana, and making a trip. How are things going for you so far?
Oh, it's going great. So, I represent, Mandeville in the House of Representatives. And so, I have a taste of most of Louisiana, even though I grew up in Mandeville. But, in the last couple months, I've been going all around the state, kind of getting a feel for everybody's issues and, what people care about. And, honestly, this is one of the issues people care about. So I'm happy to be here.
Okay. So you're 37 years old. You're a conservative, a Republican, running for governor in a red state who believes recreational cannabis should be legal. Explain, please.
Sure. So, obviously I'm maybe a little younger, so I don't have, I would say, maybe a historical prejudice against, legalization of cannabis. I brought the bill in 2021, which is the only time that a bill to legalize recreational cannabis has ever gotten out of a committee in the Louisiana legislature, was me in 2021. And so I think it was just an issue that really Republicans have, I don't know, I think that they're losing the initiative on that, right? So I think that the population of the country has moved this direction. I think even in conservative states, you've seen conservative states like Missouri, recently legalize cannabis on basically through a referendum. Mechanism doesn't exist here. But I think even when you look at the polling, you have 70% of the state or so that supports it. So it's one of those issues where I think the politicians are really just behind the eight ball. I think they're really answering to a minority of their voters when they're continuing to resist it. And I think when you look at the better balance of policies, like even from a conservative standpoint, if you support individual liberty, free markets, and limited government, it's hard to say that we should keep this illegal and continue to fund drug dealers and drug cartels by keeping it so. So I think that there's just 1,000 arguments in support of it. I think that it's not to say that it's harmless. It's not to say that everybody should go do it. But at the same time, what is the better balance of policies, whether to have it illegal and continue kind of a policy of prohibition, or to look at how do we regulate it, how do we tax it, how do we keep it safe and available. And that way you really have the money going to legitimate businesses. You have some of that tax revenue so that you can kind of offset some of the harms from it, and then you're not funding a black market, and those guys aren't going out sponsoring little league teams. They're using it for bad purposes. So it's better, I think, to have it above board.
Okay. What made you want to run for governor?
So I've been in the legislature for the last 4 years. I've really fought for some bigger battles, like basically significant tax reform, trying to make the state of Louisiana more like our neighbors, Texas and Florida, that are really growing almost exponentially versus Louisiana, which is losing 40,000 people a year. So I think that's a serious challenge that's been around for a really long time. And I think that it's a tragedy to me because Louisiana has so much resources. They have so many things going for them. I think that we could really, if we embrace some of that, we could really turn the state around and really be one of the top 10 states instead of always in the bottom. And so I think it's really a policy challenge. It's really policies that are holding us back. I tell people all the time, if we were just average, if Louisiana was just average in the country, we'd all live 4 years longer and get a 33% raise. So that's the cost of bad government. You drive across the border into Texas, you get that back. You basically come average 3.5 years of your life and a 33% raise. So it's really a tragedy that exists. And it's not from, it's not the fault of the people. It's not from a lack of resources. It's really just bad policy that was basically instituted by Huey Long 100 years ago. And until we get away from that, we're not going to fix these problems. We're not going to keep our kids here. We're going to continue down this path of decline, which I think is just totally unacceptable. So I'm kind of running as a disruption to the status quo to try and change Louisiana, put it on the right course, and I think fix some of these problems that have been really generational in our state.
Okay. So what changes do you envision building off of that? Like, give me some specifics.
Sure. So, one of the policies that I pushed a lot is the elimination of the income tax, kind of the restructuring of Louisiana's tax system to make it more like Texas or Florida, these states without income tax. You can see that they've grown about 6 times faster than us in the last census, like through 2020. And that is just one of those things where people are voting with their feet, right? They're picking up every day and moving to Texas for better jobs, better opportunity. I think that's driven by the tax policy for 2 reasons. One, not having an income tax is very attractive to everyone. I mean, nobody likes working hard to make money and then having to pay state government. The second is that really they focus more on local control. Local governments are able to solve people's problems versus kind of this centralized power and authority that Huey Long set up, which is really a situation where if you're a local government or if you're a business, you have to go to Baton Rouge to beg. And that's the setup. So if you're a local government, you're begging to get your school or your road or your bridge built. If you are a business, you're trying to get your tax break, you're trying to get a tax credit, you're trying to fight for some regulatory problem that you're trying to undo. And so Huey Long really set this up so that all the power and authorities in Baton Rouge, you got to really kiss the ring of the governor if you want anything done. He appoints all these boards and commissions and all this stuff. And I think until you unwind all that, you're going to continue to see the decline that we've seen essentially for 100 years in Louisiana. And so really getting rid of the income tax, restructuring the tax system to be more like Texas and Florida, where locals and local property taxes especially, the state relies more on sales tax. Pushing in that direction makes it more competitive for business, makes it more effective government because most of it's done locally and administered locally. And I think that is really where we have to look if we want to move forward. The other thing is education, I think is really important. I think that improving our education system is one of those foundational issues as well. I have 3 kids, 9, 7, and 5. And if everybody has to pay for their kid to go to private school, no companies are going to move here. Most people and professionals aren't going to want to stay here when they can move to places like Texas and Florida and have their tax money actually go to provide quality education. We pay the tax money here we pay about 20% more per student in Louisiana for public education than all of our neighboring states, and yet we have a much inferior product. And I think that's one of the things we have to change. In my time in the legislature, I've focused really on elementary literacy. Half of our third graders can't read on grade level, and so I focused on that as an issue. I looked at other states that have been able to do things and really improve that. Mississippi, for example, has gone from, they were 49th in the country in 4th grade reading in 2013. As a result of this bill that I actually passed this year, was copied off of Mississippi. They went from that to 21st in the country now. And so Louisiana is still down in the 40s, and so we're now down near the bottom. But basically the bill says, hey, if you can't read at the end of 3rd grade, you get held back, give extra training, extra tutoring before you get promoted up, right? It's pretty common sense for most people, like, hey, if you can't read, you probably shouldn't go on to 4th grade and beyond. But unfortunately in Louisiana, we have people moving up into high school who really can't read on a 3rd grade level. And this is a problem that's been around for generations. But I think this bill, when you implement it properly, will have a big impact on the future of the state and really just improving outcomes for everybody.
Okay. I think you touched on the answer on this next question, but if there's something you want to add, but why do you think Louisiana ranks at the bottom in health, education, and income? And I think you summarized most of it.
Yeah, I think it really is a long-term structural problem, right? I think it is. Like Huey Long set this all up so that the money all gets funneled to Baton Rouge and everybody's got to beg for it back, and the power and the control is there. It's run not on basically a low tax fair system for everybody. It's really one based on special favors. It's special favors to the governor, special favors to the who's chairman of the committee in the legislature, and that system just is not effective. It's very much like a banana republic, right? It's not like a functional government like Texas or Florida. And so I think until you eliminate that, you're gonna continue to struggle. And then I think that poverty that's created by that system continues to cause all these other issues. These low income levels, they drive education outcomes. People, if kids worried about eating every day and their parents don't have a job, it's very difficult for them to go and focus at school.
Read.
They can't get their parents don't have time to focus on their education, make sure everything is going out well. And then health outcomes, you can't go to the doctor, you're not getting nutritious food, all these other things that really compound. So raising that level of economic opportunity really solves a lot of these problems. Crime, which is a huge problem in the state, but it's, we've been the murder capital of the country. Louisiana has been the murder capital of the country since 1989. Crime is not a new issue here. It's been around for a while. And yet now we're like, oh man, where'd all this crime come from? As a result of COVID, I think it's definitely spiked, but it's been a problem for forever. And it's really linked to poverty and economic opportunity and lack of quality education. And so you got to fix these underlying issues. And then I think the rising tide will raise all ships, right? I think that you can really change the course of Louisiana because, like I said, we have such great resources. We have everything we need to be successful, and we've really used that as a crutch on bad policy for a long time instead of using it as a competitive advantage to really do better than states like Texas and Florida, which really don't have anything compared to us.
See, a lot of people wear LSU shirts all over the country, so they want to be us in that fashion. But we are at the bottom for many other things. And
yeah, wouldn't it be great to be national champs in something besides sports?
Right,
I mean, that's the reality. Like, I'd like to be national champs in income and education attainment and healthcare outcomes and life expectancy, all these things where I think we can, but it takes honestly hard work and determination in order to get there, which we haven't had for the last 100 years because we keep electing the same kind of politicians over and over again who are just there to sit in a chair. They're not really there to make big changes.
And education is key, so I definitely agree with you on that. So Louisiana passed a $52 billion budget this year?
46, I
46,
think. Yeah, 46
okay.
billion, something like that.
So 22 of that came from the federal government, roughly. 11 billion from my research comes from tax revenues and fees. So that leaves quite a bit left over in the budget that I guess we're going in debt on.
No, so I mean, there's the state has about a 10, like you said, $10 to $12 billion discretionary budget, right? This is the money that, really goes to the things that most people think about, trying to fix roads or whatever. The federal government, most of that money goes to Medicaid, the Medicaid program, which is health care for the poor and the lower income people. And so that is, depending on whether you're talking about the Medicare expansion or just Medicaid or Medicaid expansion or the Medicaid program in general, it's like the federal government gives you basically 9 cents for every cent you put up, right? So it's a huge federal match. But in reality, you look at that, that's almost half the budget, right? So I joke sometimes and say, Louisiana's not really a state government. What we are is a healthcare plan that also incarcerates people, and sometimes we pave a road.
Right.
It just shows you the scope of how much healthcare is as part of our budget. Most of that comes from the federal government. The other big piece of that is really the transportation money. We get a lot of federal money to help build highways and stuff like that. We have to provide some local match, but that mostly comes from the gas tax. And then when you get into the kind of the nuts and bolts of what I would say is kind of the discretionary portion of the budget, it's about $10 to $12 billion. We had a big surplus this year, which is kind of this leftover money that we don't really know what to do with. And so that goes to a lot of times for like local projects or some local initiatives. But really out of that 10 or 12 billion, you got about 4 billion or so that goes to support K through 12 education. You got a few billion of that goes to, to other things as well. But incarceration, we have one of the highest incarceration rates in the country. A lot of it goes to keep people incarcerated. And so you have a situation where you really only have a limited amount of money in the budget that's really discretionary, that you can say, hey, we want it to go here. You want to go to pay for, early child education or pre-K for kids instead of going to, build a bridge or something like that. That amount of money is pretty limited. But at the same time, I personally think it would be better for most of that money to stay in local communities so that, your parish council, your city council can decide, well, what are our real priorities, instead of having it done by a bunch of people in Baton Rouge who really have just, had this big budget windfall and they're deciding who gets a splash pad, which is probably not high on most people's list of needs, right? When your, school's falling down and, the bridge is out and all these other things, building splash pads across the state is probably not the best use of the money, and that we do that every year. And so, I think really focusing on keeping that money locally, raising it and spending it locally would be a much more effective way and efficient way of administering the budget.
Yeah. I saw heavy debate on how to fund early childhood development in this recent session. The consumable hemp program is the only dedicated tax that helps fund it. With that being said, why was there legislation this session to shut down the industry?
I think there was pushback in the legislature because I think that they looked at kind of the hemp law that we passed 2 years ago as kind of a backdoor marijuana legalization thing. That's what that kind of the perception was in the legislature. And I think that was really what was driving some of the pushback against the hemp industry this year in the legislature was like, hey, what do we let the genie out of the bottle in the year before? And I think that's really what was driving a lot of it. I think that early child education, something everybody generally professes to support. At the same time, I think dedicating revenue, I don't know if that's the best way of doing something. Usually that's a way to, dedicating revenue is a way to get people to swallow a pill that they otherwise don't want to swallow, right? It's the sugar, it's a spoonful of sugar helps medicine go down, right? Yeah. And so I think, some people were not necessarily on board with expanding the hemp industry, but at the same time they support early child education. So putting the money aside for that kind of gets them on board. At the same time, I think that obviously nothing passed. None of these really big legislative changes to the hemp industry happened this year. I think there was pushback on some of the stuff. So, it's going to honestly, it's going to depend on the governor's election. I think it's going to depend on the outcome of these legislative elections to see what happens next year. Because not that John Bell was even involved at all, the current governor, but the legislature will be obviously something that they can always, the legislature can screw up anything every year. I don't know who said it was, the only difference between death and taxes is that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets, right? So that's one of those things that I think every time the legislature meets, everybody kind of holds their breath to see what's going to happen. And I think next year it's going to be another situation where we're going to have to, hold their breath on a lot of different issues on whether or not, there's going to be a new governor's administration, a lot of new legislators. You're going to have to see what path are we going to go down.
Yeah, I think the only thing that saved us was the budget argument. It came down to the end, and they lost time, and
it consumed a lot of honestly. This is supposed to be a fiscal session. We're supposed to be focused on kind of fixing our taxes and everything else, and there wasn't a lot of substantive work that was done. We had about a $2 billion surplus, and most of the discussion was around that, or I would say the kind of the culture war issues, not along the lines of actually improving the state of Louisiana, not fixing the structure, not getting more people to come here, but more of like, either the culture wars or fighting over the kind of the crumbs of the tax surpluses that we have now that are really temporary, really driven by, I think, a combination of hurricane recovery spending and then also kind of the federal government throwing a bunch of COVID money and infrastructure money at us that in the future is not sustainable. So,
all right, so what do you think can be done to educate our state on cannabis and kind of clear up some of the, the haze and the issues that surround cannabis?
Yeah, misinformation.
I
think
reefer madness that's still lingering around.
I mean, I can tell you, having kind of been on the front lines of kind of educating my colleagues and honestly leading the charge in the state on it. I think that people just don't. They have perceptions. They're difficult to change. I think having a pro-cannabis legalization governor would really help a lot because then everybody has to listen. I mean, I think that makes a big difference. But the truth is, like 70% of the state supports it, so it's really an education problem for politicians,
right.
Not so much for the public. That's not with every issue, but I think on this issue specifically, the public has already moved on, and it's the politicians that have to catch up. And so,
that's a good point.
I think that's something that I've been working on for a while. I mean, like honestly, I can tell you when I brought the bill in 2021 to legalize cannabis, I think that was the first time that most Republicans and even some Democrats have ever seriously considered, like, this is a policy change that we could implement that would have a serious impact on most of the people that vote for us. It's interesting. I tell people all the time, like, this is the only tax that anybody is begging to pay. Like, there's no other one. Like, the tax on legalized cannabis is one of the only things they're ever begging to pay.
Open up their wallets.
Exactly. And it's $200 million a year, which is not all the money, but it's a significant amount of money for a poor state. I mean, for example, to put that in perspective, we spend $125 million on our entire community and technical college system, right? $125 million a year. So when you're talking about, well, maybe $200 million a year in revenue, you're like, so we could basically provide tuition-free community college to everyone in the state of Louisiana. So
that's pretty powerful.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's enough money to make positive change, I think. And like I said, you could also use it to offset some of the harms. I mean, it's not like it's harmless. It doesn't have any negative effects, but whatever they are, you can offset them with $200 million. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it makes more sense to do that versus what we spend now is like $6,000 per prosecution when somebody gets caught with marijuana, right? Like, I mean, if you don't have a municipality or a cop who just gives you a ticket and fines you $100, it could be that you get some steeper prosecutions that cost $6,000 or more for the state to prosecute, right? Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the day, most of the time they just give you a $250 fine and tell you to go on your way, but it costs the state $6,000 to get there. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and I think that most people are on board with that.
Yeah. Do you think the legislators will bring forth another bill to do harm to the hemp industry? And if so, would you be up to veto it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, not that I'm not open to any changes, but I think if it's, hey, we're just going to shut down the market, which I think some of the people definitely, that's their goal was, hey, look, we're going to, this whole thing, we're putting it back in the bottle and throwing it away. I would not allow that to happen.
It's good to hear, because there's thousands of businesses that were created and thousands of jobs. A lot comes from that.
I will tell you, I am a supporter of free markets, individual liberty, and limited government. And
Appreciate
so
that.
those are a consistent, not necessarily all of my conservative colleagues support that, but I try and be at least as ideologically consistent with that as I can.
What are your thoughts on how the medical marijuana program is functioning in Louisiana?
Well, I think the same as everybody else. The prices are too high. There's not enough participants, and I think the supply, at least being readily available to people, is restricted. So, I think that you need to have more participants. And I think it needs to be more readily available. And you're talking about people who basically have doctors' recommendations to get it, right? They shouldn't have to be paying three times the black market rate in order to get it. It's cheaper for them just to get the card and then go get it from somewhere else, right? I don't think that is the right system. And I think that expanding that, especially if you have the recreational program, the medical one kind of becomes less significant, I think, for sure. But as long as it exists, I think you need to have a more expansive program, like Mississippi or some of our, other states that I think have more competition, that have lower prices, and I think have provided better products to their constituents.
In my mind, I kind of think of the medical program as the rich man's recreational, because it's not hard to get a referral.
Yeah, no, it's
if you could just afford
$50 in a phone call, right?
Yeah, and if we could just break through that and bring down prices, because pricing is a huge issue. Because we all know insurance doesn't cover it, and if you have cancer, do you really want to drive an hour, to the pharmacy?
Yeah, it's not available.
Up?
There's only
there's some.
The current licensees for the pharmacies is like what? There's 20, I think. I think they'll be
There
allowed.
was
allowed
9,
20.
and then they allowed them to get each 3 substations under one license. So there could be potentially to have 40.
Okay.
Because there's 9 with a 10th one up for bid, which I think went to New Orleans.
Yeah, it was awarded in New
And
Orleans.
then
I think.
each license gets 3 satellite offices.
Okay. Yeah. I thought they only allowed one additional one.
It's based on patient count.
So as the counts go higher, they can possibly have another
one.
one.
Open up another one.
Yeah. So I think at the same time, if you want to go get prescription opioids, right? You can get it. There's a CVS and a Walgreens and a Walmart on every block.
Yeah.
So the things that actually kill people, you can get everywhere. And then medical marijuana, though you got to
drive an hour.
you gotta get your covered wagon and start the Oregon Trail in order to go find one.
Yeah. So do you think the medical industry was trying to shut down the hemp industry this year?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. So I really wasn't involved too much in that battle. Obviously, I think they look at it as competition because they serve a similar need, I think. So, anytime you have these kind of complementary products, I would say, people say, well, if the price of medical marijuana is so high, I can go and look for some, these lower levels of THC and some of these other products that are, hemp derived. And, I think some customers definitely go and look for that. And I think that makes sense. So, it's one of those things where if you have a captive market, you're always trying to use the government to squash competition. So to the extent you're competing it. A lot of times they tell me that they're competing against the black market, right? Which is true. They do compete against the black market. So, but honestly, I think that's why having, free markets, competitive regulation, I think is the best way to have, better products and lower prices for everybody.
So the medical program, I believe, is set to sunset January 1st, 2025.
Yeah.
So at that point, do you think they'll open it up to other growers?
I think this is a battle. This is a battle that happens in the legislature almost every year. Is that they want to allow other growers, they want to allow more licensees to, open the medical pharmacies. I don't think that's going to continue. I think that there will eventually be more growers allowed. I think there will eventually be more dispensary or pharmacy permits issued. I think it's just you're changing culture slowly, right? Which is part of the deal. Is inertia is probably the strongest force in politics. So that, the way things are, it's pretty difficult to change. And so I think over time they're going to start allowing more growers. I think they're going to allow a more permissive permitting environment for the dispensaries, but we're just not there today.
Yeah. I went to a few of the committee hearings when they were thinking about expanding it, and I could see heads nodding,
Yeah.
in agreement. But then I heard comments that they're wanting to protect the two that have invested money in the state until they can recoup their money, which I wish they would think that way about the hemp industry. It would be nice to recoup our money before they try to shut us down. So, I mean, there's definitely some good old boy protections going on with the monopoly that is really set up right now.
So this is Louisiana.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
Edwin Edwards went to jail for selling casino licenses, right? So, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, having a free market is a better way of running, is a much better way of running running the state. And so I don't think the state should be in the business of picking winners and losers, but, they set a minimum level of qualifications, and they should open it up more broadly for sure. And I think that in the legislature and in the committees, it's it's honestly a new conversation. It used to be just a few years ago, marijuana was kind of a toxic word that, just getting the medical marijuana program established was very difficult. The reason there's two growers is because I think it was never going to happen. And then they said, well, we'll give Southern and LSU a license. Everybody loves Southern and LSU. And so like I said, when you're creating these things, you're trying to give them some sugar to swallow the medicine with, and it was like, hey, you got to support Southern and LSU, so that's why you got to vote for this medical program. And so that's where we're coming from. Where we're going, I think, is definitely more broad and more open, but you got a long way to go as far as changing these kind of hearts and minds of the politicians on, really what do their citizens want. And honestly, all these things, they're controlled by people. Like, people vote for their legislators, people vote for their governor. If this is an issue for you, if you care about it, go and get involved, vote for people, tell everyone about it, and that's how you change. It can change overnight if you demand it. If you stay at home and don't vote and you don't tell anybody, then it's going to stay where it is.
Go vote.
So,
how hard was it to get your recreational bill out of committee?
The sheriff's association, the DA's association, both of them opposed it. It was definitely a lot of work. I mean, this is a whole new idea. I think the people that voted for it, including the Republicans that voted for it, had to be comfortable that this is what their district and what the people that their constituents are, that they really supported it, which it's almost universal. The polling is very strong that, especially in, more urban areas like Baton Rouge and, St. Tammany even, there's pretty strong support for this. I mean, there's some areas of the state where it's maybe not the majority, but even then, so for example, like the Monroe area, polling a couple of years ago was that even in the Monroe area, where it was probably the least supportive of legalizing recreational cannabis, it was still almost 50-50. So it's something where almost everybody's constituents are in the majority in favor of it. I think everybody's more afraid of that very vocal 10% or 20% that believe, I think, some of the misinformation about it. I like to point out all the time, I was like, who do you think has more violent crime, Louisiana or Colorado? I was like, we have significantly more violent crime than Colorado. I was like, who do you think has safer roads, Louisiana or Colorado? It's just because Colorado is kind of the boogeyman of, legalization of cannabis or marijuana. And, we have something like 50% more highway deaths per capita than Colorado does. So if this was the cause, if marijuana legalization was the cause of all these problems, how come it's so, how come there is absolutely no correlation between these things and, the outcome? So anyway, I think to some extent you got to educate some of these people, which you may or may not be able to reach, on what the actual impacts of the policy are. And in reality, there's a reason that more and more states are legalizing it and none are going back, right? I think in general, citizens are happier in that kind of system. I mean, for example, Arizona legalized it years ago. Nobody ever says, oh my gosh, Arizona's falling apart now. Right. Everybody's moving to Arizona. So, and it's a relatively conservative state. At the end of the day, the citizens did it through referendum. And I think in Louisiana, if we had a vote on it today, it would pass. I think so for sure.
So your bill from 21 that you got out of committee, it did not limit the amount of growers. And would you push for a bill similar going forward, or would you not support a bill that would limit the growers, and would you push to have it more of a free market?
Yeah, I modeled that somewhat off of Oklahoma, which has a medical program, but really a kind of a wide open medical program, right? And I think some of the things that we've seen from Oklahoma is maybe it'd be slower to roll it out. I mean, not necessarily have a hard cap initially, but maybe roll it out so that you give X amount of licenses year 1, X amount of licenses year 2, X amount of licenses year 3, and just kind of open it up gradually so that there's not some giant boom and bust cycle like we saw in Oklahoma. But at the end of the day, I don't want anybody having extraordinary profits because they're able to control entrance to the market, right? Mm-hmm. So really it's going to be a question of what is the most responsible way in order to avoid a lot of the blowback that we saw in Oklahoma. But on the other side of that, I think is California, who really significantly limited the licenses and who could get them, and as a result, the black market flourished, and the supply basically remained in the black market. It wasn't such a situation where it really did a lot of good to legalize it because you basically had drug dealers and cartels running the whole thing anyway.
Yeah, I believe it's a $5 billion legal market and $10 billion black market. So so over-regulating
it's not the answer.
More to the black market.
It's not the answer, for sure. And so I think that you really want a situation where you just kind of responsibly and reasonably grow the legal market so that it is essentially a free market.
Yeah. So in a potential bill that you would sign for rec, would you support a clause in there that would support workers, from not being denied a job if they tested positive for marijuana? I know this is kind of a hard question because you have, state employees, federal employees, private employees.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly you should probably treat it like, especially from the medical pro, because we have the same problem with the medical marijuana currently, right? It's like I think if you have a prescription or a recommendation from a doctor, I think you should treat it like you treat any drug, any opioids. Like if you're on some kind of painkiller or whatever, to the extent it doesn't interfere with your job and you're allowed to continue to work with the doctor's recommendation. So hey, look, I have this. I think that you should not, the state should not go in and say, well, the private employer cannot, I think the private employer should treat it basically the same as a recommendation as a regular prescription. But for an employer who wants to say, hey, look, somebody's smoking marijuana, can I fire them? I don't want to get involved in that non-medical, in that non-medical relationship. So like if it's not something that's been recommended by a doctor. If the employer wants the freedom to be able to choose that, and that's one of their conditions of employment, then they can do that. I think in my conversation with most employers, they don't do that now because it's almost, it's very difficult to find employees. And so like if essentially that's how you want to operate your business, I think, especially in a legalized recreational market, it's going to be very difficult for you to find capable employees when you say, hey, look, if you ever do have any, contact with marijuana, then I'm going to fire you if you test positive. Yeah. I think there'll probably be a few employers that do that. And I mean, maybe they'll do it for, some maybe federal, truck drivers or forklift operators, those kind of guys. At the same time, I think the federal laws will probably come into sharper focus, I think, in the next couple of years too, where they'll probably drop the requirements for those kind of strict marijuana compliance and stuff. Really, it should be focused. I think really, honestly, the law should focus on impairing. If they're impaired, you should never be impaired in operating these things. Not just, hey, do you test positive, which doesn't really indicate whether or not you're ever impaired.
And I know testing is getting better to where you could see how far back you smoked. I know they've been working on that for a while, and that's what's hard to do.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I mean, if you're not just assessing how impaired the person is, it's hard to come up with a definitive number. It's not like, blowing blood alcohol content, right? You don't have the same level of accuracy.
So this next question comes from my son and his friends. They're young, but they want to know where do you think the tax revenue should go to that would be generated from recreational cannabis? Where would you like to see it go?
Sure. I mean, honestly, like I said, dedicating the revenue is kind of complicated because when you dedicate it, you're basically tying the hands of, whatever your priorities are today, 10 years from now, are they going to be the same, right? I would say practically, if you want to get it passed, I think putting some into law enforcement who right now, they use these kind of fines and fees to kind of operate their budgets and stuff. I think putting some of that into law enforcement to kind of alleviate some of these concerns that it's going to make people less safe. It's like, well, if you're given, in my original bill, I think I put 20% to law enforcement and said, hey, let's use this to actually make people safer so that we kind of get past the argument of like, hey, this is going to make people unsafe, right? So not only are they going to save money by not having to enforce these laws that aren't really followed anyway, but physically allocating that money to them so that they are able to actually go out and catch, the fentanyl dealers and the carjackers and the murderers that everybody, hates and despises, that we can focus on those things. I think that's a good idea. I think putting some in, addiction services, I think that's a good place to put it. I think other states have done that as well. Drug education, putting it into some of that money into that. I think that's a good thing to do, because you should, educate people on the risks of not just marijuana or cannabis, but anything, alcohol and cigarettes and all this other stuff. So I think putting into that, and then honestly, early child education is a great thing, just because of the return on investment for state taxpayer. I think it's a great way to spend the money. At the same time, I don't want to dedicate too much of it when you're not directly correlated to some of the problems that it causes, right? So the more you dedicate, like I said, you're going to tie your hands for the years in the future, and that makes it just not the best policy, just because obviously your priorities can change, from year to year, and I think you got to be able to be somewhat flexible in what you're going to do with the money.
So off of those answers, so 20% to the sheriff's department or law enforcement. So if there's less arrests happening, then there's less people to process. Shouldn't their costs kind of go down? Shouldn't their imprisonments go down? Wouldn't that free up funds on that place? And
yeah, it does.
I would, while it's nice to offer that to them, I feel their cost would go down, and maybe more money go to addiction recovery, trying to help this opioid epidemic and get fentanyl off the street and help those that were affected so drastically by it. That's just my input on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you.
To change your mind on
No,
that.
I mean, I don't. Like I said, all these things it's all negotiable. I'll tell you the breakdown is going to be is whatever I get to the legislature. That's what it is, So.
And you won't be the one writing the bill.
Yeah, a legislator will be carrying the bill, absolutely. And so I think that at the end of the day, whatever, I had this argument on the floor of the House, and I was like, listen, we can put it all in a barrel and burn it, and we will still be better off than having it all go to drug dealers or drug cartels, right? And so that was what the big debate was on the floor of the House, was like, well, where are you going to spend this money? Well, let's argue about that. And I was like, listen, at the end of the day, this is money that we're not collecting right now if we don't legalize it. And I was like, putting it all in a barrel and burning it we'd be all better off, because at least then it's not going to drug dealers or drug cartels, right? Yeah. And so I think that's going to be a discussion of where is it going to go. And I think you got to target some of it to, the harms related to it, and I think law enforcement, that helps a little bit. I think addiction services, I think that helps. And then some of these other things I think are just going to be wherever we can get through the legislature.
Maybe some helping getting expungements for those that were arrested. I know there's always,
there's
calls for that.
Well, the criminal justice system in general is significantly underfunded, and we use really fines and fees on people that, you get traffic tickets and stuff like that to really fund our whole justice system, which, it might be good to say, hey, let's take some of that money, which I think was one of the bills brought this previous session, was to say, hey, let's use some of this money to kind of provide some money to the justice system so we can get the kind of swift and speedy justice and, fair justice that I think everybody wants, versus saying like, hey, if you're poor, you're going to get thrown in jail until you can make bail, and you pay all your fines and fees for your traffic tickets, or else we're going to throw you in jail too. It's not really the best system for the citizens.
Yeah. So you're a family man. What would you say to those that are skeptical in saying that, it would destroy our youth, cannabis?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say at the end of the day, if your kid's going to smoke marijuana or do whatever, I think that's your responsibility as a parent to talk to them about it. I think the risk of them doing that exists whether it's legal or not. And at the same time, like for me as a parent, I'll tell my kids, hey, look, don't smoke, don't do any kind of drugs, don't drink alcohol, whatever. When you're adult, you're 21 or whatever, you make your own choices, you're a big boy now. But I would be more comforted by the fact knowing that if he bought something that was safe and regulated and packaged and said exactly what was in it and they knew where they got it from, I would feel better as a parent knowing that that was the case, versus they went to a drug dealer and they bought something from the street, something off the street that could be God knows what from God knows where, right? And I mean, I think that is a significantly greater problem. And then plus you're interacting with drug dealers who are obviously not the most, they're not the most amenable people, and they're dealing in the black market. They can't exactly call the cops if something goes wrong, right? So that's why there's so much violence associated with it. So I think from a parental perspective, you're much better off having it being safe and regulated versus a black market that's run by criminals. And I think that's where you see why is violent crime so much lower in Colorado. I think maybe that's a reason why. You have this significantly reduced black market, at least in the the domestic market for cannabis. I think that helps.
That's a great answer, and I wouldn't have thought that you would have come from that direction on that answer, but I think that would help a lot of parents kind of make their way through.
Yeah, it's a
these
legitimate.
decisions.
I mean, it's a legitimate concern because I think you think, hey, well, my kids get alcohol, and is it better that way? I mean, the truth is, we had prohibition of alcohol, and it resulted in significant death and loss of
Yes.
life and conflict.
Poison from
Yeah,
poisoned alcohol.
and also exactly, and the collateral damage from having it be bootleg
Right.
alcohol, right? It's the exact same thing. And so when you're looking at what is better, we made that decision with alcohol a long time ago because it really was not a good policy. We've kept the same policy with marijuana, and I don't think that it's been very successful, and it's suffers from similar challenges.
So how do we repair the damages caused to families for those that were incarcerated from cannabis? That's an open-ended question, but there are people that have spent years in prison.
There's people buried in Angola for marijuana possession. I mean, that's the truth. I think you got to change the law. We've done that to some extent. We criminalized at least the small, simple possession of marijuana. That was just done 2 years ago. It could have been a felony prosecution. It still can be, I think, for multiple offenses. Like the fourth simple possession offense can still be a felony, I think. So I think you get rid of those laws, obviously. The people that have been convicted, most of them are not in jail now in Louisiana. There's not really anybody there in jail for simple possession. I think allowing the expungements and helping to fund the expungements of people that got convicted of things like simple possession, not distribution, but just the possession. I think that makes sense so that you free them up from things like job searches and apartment searches and stuff like that. Kind of help them get their life back together. But honestly, some of it is just stop digging the hole, which is stop convicting people of possession charges to begin with, and really, like I said, get rid of the black market and make it above board so that you don't have to worry about those things.
Do you think cannabis will ever be accepted as sociably as alcohol is in Louisiana, and should it be?
Yeah, I think it's almost a generational thing. I mean, I think especially the kids that are, I'm 37. I think the kids that are maybe a generation or so younger than me, I mean, they look at alcohol almost as kind of like, this is a poison you're putting in your body that causes all these kind of effects, kills people all the time. I mean, you read the paper every day as some drunk driver, kills themselves, their family, or somebody else. That doesn't really happen with cannabis. I mean, I think that it's not that there's no negative effects, but I think, the next day, most people don't go and say, hey, had a gummy yesterday. I've never heard this. Maybe that exists, but I've never heard anybody say, hey, I took a gummy yesterday and now I'm just going to lay on the couch all day because I'm so hungover. But alcohol has serious negative effects, and I think that the younger generations kind of look at it that way. I haven't mentioned this, but I've never even used marijuana. I don't smoke it, never have. I was an Eagle Scout, but I just look at it from an economic and a policy perspective that it's the better policy. But I think really the younger generation are definitely more open to it. I think they look at alcohol, more on the lines of this has much greater negative health consequences. I think maybe much more negative societal consequences than cannabis does.
You're right.
And so, as obviously as they grow up, that becomes the majority of the population who feels that way.
That's some good points. Do you think cannabis would boost the tourism in Louisiana?
Oh yeah, I mean, so I don't know if you've been to New Orleans recently. I mean, it's legal for all intents and purposes. It's really just, do they advertise on the flyers that it's legal? No, but I mean, like it's available everywhere. And so really, I think you use it from a couple of angles, right? So one is people would come here, especially from our neighboring states. If it's illegal, essentially, or restricted in Texas or these other southern states that aren't going to legalize recreational marijuana anytime soon. New Orleans is a giant attraction and, a regional destination for people. Having that being available, I think would significantly increase tourism. I think also is that you're going to have tax money available. And in my initial bill, I put a lot of that, half of the tax money went to the locals to spend, right? So you can use it cleaning up the streets, like, getting maybe all the homeless people off the streets, giving them some kind of drug addiction treatment so that they're not there kind of dragging down the rest of the area. And I think if you have an additional source of tax revenue, you have the ability to clean some of these things up, which would, kind of be a virtuous cycle, right? And trying to improve everything.
Yeah. Every city I've driven in Colorado, all the sidewalks are brand new, the downtowns are remodeled, schools are brand new. I mean, really,
Colorado makes there's a significant
improvements.
amount of revenue from it.
Yeah.
Significant amount of revenue.
Yeah. If you become governor, how long do you think it would take to implement this into, I mean, I know it has to go through legislation and passed. Do you foresee certain legislators willing to maybe take up your bill that made it out of committee and adopt it and try to get it in the first session? As you
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the first session, we maybe bring that in the first session. I don't know if it would pass in the first session. Maybe. I mean, like I would support it, and I would do, everything I can. I think there's a lot of, personally, I think there's a lot of other pressing issues that would have to be addressed. Such as the tax structure, the education, insurance, homeowners insurance is a huge crisis that we're going through. I think some of those things, you only really get a few shots, every year on some big issues that you could take on. So marijuana is not going to be on the top of that list for me. But I think in maybe the second term, especially when you can pass the tax that accompanies it at the same time, I think that would probably be the most likely time to do it, would be probably in the second year when you can pass the accompanying tax, so that you can kind of put all the pieces in place. And, I think that would probably be the most likely time for that to happen. You could also do it as a constitutional amendment. The constitutional amendment kind of pushes it off. It's a higher bar in each chamber, but it just gives it to the people. Say, hey, look, do you think that legalization is something that we should go to? And it would put in the Constitution, which I'm not necessarily in favor of, but it's the only way that you can really make it a referendum, right? Is that you give people the option to vote. So, your legislature, your local legislature doesn't have to say, hey, I support marijuana legalization, which people will be mad about. But they can say, listen, I gave you the vote. If you don't like it, go vote against it, right? If you do, then go out and vote for it. And I think that would be another option to put it forward to people.
We're going to have to work on that answer. I need it first year.
Like I said, I think that I definitely wouldn't.
Because it solves some of the problems. The tax revenue would help with some of those other issues. So you need to marry them. We're going to have to find a way to marry that. What would the qualification factors for someone who wants to participate in the recreational cannabis industry? What would the qualifications be in your bill, or a bill that you would want to sign?
Yeah, I think they would be relatively lax. I don't think you want to restrict people too much.
Right.
I would say similar to whatever the permit is for alcohol, alcohol distribute, if you're, your ATC permit for a bar or whatever, I think it would be something similar to that.
It's funny you bring that up, because I made that point in a meeting last year, that the manufacturer's license to distill or to make wine, I think, is only $1,000. And it was in regards to Miss Newell's bill. I think she was wanting to charge like $50,000 for a license.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just trying to make that comparison. And
make it more reasonable.
Yeah, and they were like, well, this is nothing like alcohol. And, of course it's not, but.
Yeah, it is somewhat different, I think. But
Yeah.
mostly I think it's somewhat different in, just kind of where it is societally versus the harm caused by cannabis. That's the reality. So.
And you and I were talking before we started this about Mississippi and how they have a tiered system where.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go. I think that, moving away from what Oklahoma did, which is kind of the model from my previous legislation in 2021, it's like I think you definitely need to have it where, the smaller fish pay a smaller fee and the big fish pay a big fee. And I think that's just when you're looking at the regulatory oversight involved, like, how many inspectors are going to have to go out there, like how much time are they going to have to spend? It's definitely a bigger burden on the bigger,
Right.
the bigger producers.
Who do you know that's benefited from cannabis?
It's funny, when you're a Republican who brings the first bill to legalize marijuana, how many Republicans come out to you and say, you know what, I've supported this forever. I couldn't believe it when Nixon made this illegal, created this war on drugs in the 70s. And you got 75-year-old bankers who are like, look, this is the best thing, you got to keep fighting for this. It's really important. And, the Republicans and the older generation, hey, we're really behind this too. It's not just a thing. So I've had a lot of people come to me and say, hey, look, like I had cancer, and the only thing that got me through chemo was, marijuana. That was the only thing that saved me. And a lot of them say, hey, I was 100% against it until my son said, hey, look, you're struggling with chemo. Why don't you go try this? I've had a lot of older people too that had pain problems. They were on opioids. They suffered from opioids, opioid addiction as a result of some kind of pain issue. And they got off of the opioids and they used, marijuana or something to kind of alleviate their pain. So I've heard all these stories from all over the state as a result of authoring this bill in 2021. So there's definitely a much broader, I think a much broader understanding of the benefits of it. And like I said, I tell people all the time, like alcohol and cigarettes are both legal. No doctors recommend that people go out and smoke and drink. It doesn't happen.
They used to.
Yeah, in the 60s when they said, hey, go smoke cigarettes, you have smaller babies, right? It'll help you relax. But like for cannabis, you have thousands of recommendations every day, not just in Louisiana, but all over the country, of doctors saying, hey, this will actually improve your health, right? So it is somewhat different that way. And I think that that's a good perspective for people to have is if this is really as harmful as some people paint it as, you wouldn't have thousands of doctors every day recommending to their patients that'll make them better. And that's, I think, an important thing to keep in perspective.
So you actually haven't had anyone like really close to you
No.
that has benefited? Yeah.
No. I mean, honestly,
when you do, you appreciate it even more.
Yeah.
It really will hit you because my dad had cancer last year. A lot of people around me, and plus I get calls all the time, thanking us for what we do, and so it's pretty powerful. And
yeah, no, I mean, it's.
I don't want you to have any.
Yeah, I don't want it. Don't put that on me. No.
I don't want you to have that.
But I have heard a lot of those stories, and it really surprises me. Some of the people that come out. I mean, and these are older Republicans who this is almost something. This is something that they've had to repress probably for a long time.
They feel the floodgates.
Yeah, they're just like, hey, look, like I'm glad someone's out there saying that who thinks like me because this is necessary.
Yeah. Well, you answered this one. Have you ever used cannabis?
I've never used it. Never
I got
once.
some gummies in my car.
It's okay.
You sure?
I'm sure. Yes.
I mean, it's like a glass of wine, but without the hangover.
That's right. I understand. I mean, I just at the end of the day, I think it gives me a unique position, right?
Yeah.
Is that I can advocate for this not from my personal, not because of some personal issue I have or some personal belief that I have, but really as a policy. I think that this is better for everybody,
right?
And so I think it gives me a good position to be in to advocate for it because personally, it doesn't bother one way or the other. It's not going to impact my life. And I was like, but I can say from a society perspective, from a state perspective, I think that it's better for the citizens.
So the old saying, the younger vote doesn't count. If you could talk to the younger people watching this video right now, tell them to, give them your speech right now and your spill to go out and vote and make a difference.
Sure. Yeah. No. So I mean, I think, Louisiana has had challenges forever. Like I said, probably for 100 years since Huey Long, we've basically been at the bottom. And there's a lot of candidates in this race. You got about 7 people running right now. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you like the status quo, if you like continuously losing people. If you like cannabis being illegal forever, at the end of the day, if you want that to be the case, you can vote for anybody else. You vote any other candidate, doesn't matter which one, and you will have the status quo. I guarantee you. And I was like, but if you would like to see significant changes in the state, as I said earlier, if you would like to get the 4 years of your life back and a 33% raise just to have Louisiana be average, if you would like to have more reasonable laws on cannabis, I was like, I'm your only choice. There's nowhere else to go. And so you're going to have to be motivated, though. You got to go vote. You got to convince all your friends and your family to go vote, and you got to, actually care and get involved because it's not going to happen on accident. And I think that's one of the things where, my generation and the, younger people, we kind of look at politics as like, this is my grandpa's game, right? And it's like, well, when it's your grandpa's game and you get your grandpa's rules. And, if you don't show up, that's what you're going to keep. And so I think Louisiana has significant opportunity to not just catch up to our southern neighbors, but I think to exceed them. But it's really going to take a revolution to do that. It's going to take a complete abandonment of the status quo, which is really what I represent. And that's going to be on the ballot October 14th. And I would appreciate your vote. I appreciate your support. And, do everything you can in order to help us win.
When would the last day to register to vote be?
I'm not sure. Maybe like a month before, something like that. Usually it's about a month, I think, out from the election.
Okay.
So
That's an important
it's going to
date
probably
to
be in
keep
September.
mind.
Yeah, it's probably going to be in like September or something. So,
Okay.
go register to vote and definitely show up to vote.
All right. Well, Richard,
Well, no, I appreciate it, Blaine.
It was great talking. We're going to definitely do it again. We're throwing our support behind you, and we appreciate you coming out to Lafayette and visiting and trying to start this grassroots movement. And thank you.
No, thanks for having me.
All right.